And thank you for that. In fact, these are my
Can you use the microphone, please?
Oh, sure. This is my home space in Roundtable. I lived there for 20 odd years. Go all the time to that precise town hall and sit outside it and walk around Finsbury Park a lot. So, yes, how can we make some connections? I think austerity would be somewhere to begin. That is, austerity would be one way to talk about a constraint on the self-sufficient local authority. Another issue is to think about the replacement of financial flows for the welfare state by extraction of value from the city. In that sense, it sounds not so strange because a lot of local activity in urban governance and certainly built environment development historically and across a very wide range of places rests on the extraction of value from land. And the UK has been quite slow to construct that relationship between local authorities and land. So I would sort of slightly step back from particular formulation of critique, although I don't disagree with you all. So that's just to put, to perhaps make a link to the riff that the imposed theme of self-sufficiency provoked for me. It's a riff that takes me straight back to my research project, which is funded by this wonderful group. And that's to think of self-sufficiency in the lines that the Splur promoted around questions of self-governance, decentralization, or a kind of integrated governance, which is what the current habitat-inspired SDG speak talks about, integrating governance across different scales of a nation-state. And placing that alongside what comes through in an awful lot of the academic research at the moment about urbanization, which is a strong globalization of urban policy, of which ironically the habitat is one as well. Talking about scalar solutions to government while being yourself a trans-scalar international urban policy initiative is deeply ironic. So globalization of urban policy and the extraction of urban value. So this often goes under the misnomer of financialization. Many different kinds of ways of extracting value and organizing that in terms of loans and time and entities and so on exist. Are they all financialized? No. So the extraction of urban value is what I want to focus on. So that's the one bundle that comes to my mind. What does it mean that at a moment in urban development policy that a lot of pressure is being put on regularizing the relationships between national, regional and local government in poor countries, getting all that scalar hierarchy lined up well, adequately, effectively, good words, comes at just a moment that actually the extraction of urban value is going on in Haringey, but actually it's a big motor of the global economy, and we can hear David Harvey in our heads. So this is what does this mean? Is one of my questions. It's not one I'm going to address, but I think the problematic of that coincidence, the rescaling of governance capacity through development initiatives versus this moment of very powerful globalization of both ideas and investment. And then the second one I think is a corollary of that, which is where is urban politics in a world of globalized policy investment and fragmented extended urbanization and so on. So we have to rethink the territorialization of urban politics, and that comes directly out of the first one. So this is just my usual slide on the conceptual landscape of urban studies being really up in the air. How can we think about urbanization, the place, where the urban is, the vocabulary and categories that we use are problematic. The dimensions and geography of urbanization is one that is hard to reconcile with the territorialized self-sufficiency of a decentralized urban governance system. So we have a very complex landscape and many different kinds of urban contexts to think about. Now, our lovely friend Sue Parnell and her colleagues from ACC have mobilized the first issue I raised about the policy changes of the inspired by the SDGs and Habitat towards a strong intellectual agenda. And I think this sets a powerful agenda for all of us. What I want to pick up on here is in the middle, the idea that it's policy deliberations that are going to be formative of a new global urban imaginary. Now, what can that possibly mean when the policy deliberations and governance terms are about some sort of rescaled hierarchy of the urban self-sufficient decentralization, blah, blah, blah. So I just kind of poke a little bit at that claim in the context of us thinking about this question of territorialized governance imaginations. This is one paper that came through in preparation for Habitat, asking for effective multi-level governance, adequate legal frameworks and partnerships and so on. So in a sense to speak a little bit to the formal agendas of institutions, law and all that. And this strikes me, although there is some issues about global processes and so on, it's a very, it's like a chessboard imagination in a way. And Sue and Co picked this up at the end of their paper. The scalar question requires far greater engagement, I would say. Multinodal urban governance and power regimes, so this speaks to that sort of integrated governance agenda. And what I think is that if we jump out of we should all start to think within the policy framework and think, oh, what have scholars been doing about governance and urbanization and flows, that we could have an interesting conversation at this, about this geography really of governance and self-sufficiency. So my wager is that we do well to open ourselves to a range of conceptualizations coming from many different places, be willing to think across different urban contexts. And in a way, that was also the wager of this tranche of funding from the ESRC. So on the one hand, looking through the interconnectedness of the urban and the repeated formation of things across the world, satellite cities or huge star-architect buildings, major new urban developments. In a way, there's a repeated format often across different urban contexts, and we can think with that. It's worth looking, especially because these are connected to the same players in terms of investment, for example, same ideas in terms of delivery, and so on. And then the looser idea of shared features, this definitely merit. I don't think we can say it's not worth doing comparisons across Africa or doing comparisons between very different places. Merit in being provoked by things that have resonance, seem worth thinking about across different contexts. And then if we're not sure there's anything to say from one context to another, certainly we can listen to each other as we launch our concepts into wider conversations. So this is our project, Governing the Future City, looking at large-scale developments in Shanghai, Johannesburg and London. And this is a graphic from Johannesburg. The example is the now fairly well-known Corridors of Freedom. You heard from Parks Tower last night. So it's his big idea. The BRT system driven through the city by the FIFA investment supported by the central government, FIFA-related development, World Cup for soccer. And around that would be centralization of a very dispersed city and centralization of development for the poor. We looked in Shanghai at a very large port development, a deep sea port, which was again a very driven by a national initiative to make Shanghai strategic in deep water port capability internationally. And this is the one on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we're looking at one of a railway and industrial current usage site in London, which is being redeveloped thanks to a large national investment in HS2 high-speed train to the north and an east-west link promoted by the metropolitan region. So we have some starting points which are our intuitive basis for comparing very shared features, very large projects, multi-jurisdictional, over long time periods, very large scale, lots of governance challenges. We're into the governance challenges. We sort of came to more layers of comparability over time, but that was our starting point. And one of our ending points is that each of them has given us an insight into the way in which the re-territorialization of governance around particular projects, particular bits of the city, cut across scales in terms of actors, agency, imagination, practices, and so on. So following the really interesting work of Ludovic Albert and colleagues, and very much inspired in their case by Bangalore, India, this idea that an assemblage of capacity emerges around particular projects, pulling together agents who can't be consequently easily identified as being global or local, that in fact their capacities are very mixed up, but they come to depend on this particular fragment of the territory. So in a sense, self-sufficient, often to the extent that they must construct value out of that place, that context. So these are three cases of assembling a transcalar agency. So going from kind of more global-oriented things at the top to the bottom. A new actor in the London area, kind of interested in financializing private rented sector, so American pension funds tentatively arriving, nervous, everyone's a bit nervous about that. Some developers that are very powerful, very global companies, but in fact are very deeply locally embedded, Londoners, with a very London imagination of what they should do, and then some circulating imaginations about what London might be in the future. The investment from the central government, the Department of Transport, who sees the land they own in the area as a way to get value for themselves, they're basically property developers too, and as we heard, the changing context of local finance, which is not just cuts, but a reorientation to deliver the funding for local government through business rates, that is redeveloping, getting more and more businesses in your area, and through extracting value from the land and assets you have. And then at the local scale, we have a very fragmented territorial process of managing development and the planning gain extraction of value from this very particular piece of land. So in a way, we have a system of self-sufficiency, but it's highly transcalar, and it is organized around both the production of value, its extraction, contestation over its extraction. It's not clear that it's just about, feeding some terrible global company, and also, ironically, I think often the corrosion of that value by the kinds of places that are being produced. And you can tell a similar story across the other contexts. For time, I'll just jump to the images and tell you about that a bit more. So here we have the nationally important strategic investment in this deep sea port of Shanghai, and a metropolitan strategy of defining satellite cities. And the satellite city of Lingang, which we're looking at, is meant to develop to support the deep water port. In fact, the port activity bypassed the city, and there's a lot of effort to try and restructure that city. An interesting point is that some of the design elements of that city were organized through an international competition. A German company won, but the reason for the winning and the selection was very deeply locally embedded. So what I'm interested in are these torsions of the transcalar, where the global local is, I suppose we could be Swinglerian and call it local, but we would, I think, have to work hard to think about that. And then thinking about the way in which the complexities of governance arrangements in the Chinese development context mean that from the smallest to the metropolitan municipal government have been some very complicated negotiations of responsibility, financing, and outcomes. The corridors of freedom, we see on the one hand a global investment from the French, interested in compacting the city and supporting sustainability. Even though compaction was something South Africans had wanted forever, we didn't really have to be inspired by the French to want compaction of our cities, but there you go, they funded that. The municipal budget is also very interesting because it's aggregated at a metropolitan scale, and property taxes flow from any development that's done, but can be pulled together and invested strategically across the city. And one of the stories we see here is a very agile local agency building capacity to draw in developers who are not used to investing in a city or in very low-income housing, who are used to investing in big housing in the suburbs. So one of the things that we see is, this is one of the images, we see as a comparative insight we draw from Johannesburg, and my collaborator Phil Harrison, who has worked on this case, we were all kind of surprised by how clever South Africa's municipal financing is, actually, and how much it facilitates developmental investments at the same time as running off property. So in a way, what this makes us demystify land value extraction and think rather about the institutional architecture, the format, the geography of self-sufficiency in terms of eating up your own city, the land value extraction, that it's possible to do that differently. I think very important for London. So some part of the cleverness of the planners here was to preempt investment opportunities with some clever designs about intensifying what are effectively inner suburban areas, and coming up with ways in which developers can be fast-tracked and miss out on all the costly stuff. So you can go from a suburban house to a 10-story flat through their designs. Now the case in London, Old Oak and Park Royal in the northwest of London, is an area where, through some arcane informal planning process that drives London, a whole bunch of houses and jobs are meant to be delivered. Okay, well, somebody just made it up. Infrastructure costs, well, they've gone from 1 to 1.5 to 2.5 billion pounds. This is one of the early plans, and the blue shows you the infrastructure investment from the central government really driving this potential development, so it's meant to become really a kind of Manhattan. The tricky thing is the government has said no to so far to requests to fund the development, and the government says the development must pay for itself. Now that's a very usual format. So the mayor, in fact, comes from the mayor's review. He was asking the central government to please donate some of the land to fund the development and so on. They are not so interested in placing an investment here, and say it must come from the land itself, which is business as usual in London. And business as usual we see here is the identification of very large areas which can be intensified very much. So really change the character of certain bits of the city, and lots of opportunity areas that keep on growing here, pockmarking the landscape. There's Old Oak to show you its relative size. It's quite a large chunk of the central city you might be familiar with, would be equivalent. This is the very localized practices that insert themselves into this transscalar governance arrangement, which is organized around reimagining and financing and redeveloping the area. So residents in traditional terraced houses, very old industrial landscape, some new intensification already from local authorities looking for ways to develop and make money, and a lot of railway land, which the Department of Transport doesn't want to give up. These are the kind of imaginations that are coming forward from very large global companies hired to do that. But in fact, the story of the development is very haphazard, lots of different things going on. So we can't tell a straightforward story. We have a range of different actors, all seeking to make some money out of the city. And what goes on, and I would just comment here on the viability assessments, is that increasingly a lot of things have to come out of the profit of the developers from planning gain. The roads, the bridges, the community infrastructure, health services facilities, education, schools, any of the artists, for example. So this is probably why there's no affordable housing, because they have to pay for the art facilities in Haringey. So everything must come out of the planning gain envelope. So it leads to, this would be my point, it leads to a very reduced built environment. So kids are playing on the roof, you see the green up there. Almost no public space outside the footprint of the building. Very high rise, and this is pushed by the planners to extract enough affordable housing. So in order to do our welfare state, to get affordable housing, we're producing terrible environments. So we can ask for affordable housing, but we'll be careful what we ask for. So here we get a very difficult set of outcomes, trying to realize the public interest. And I'm suggesting the planners are not being wicked here, that is, they are trying to do their best. And a lot of the developers are actually quite interested in the public space and have faced a lot of reputational damage if they don't deliver something people would love. But the financial architecture and the self-sufficiency, indeed, the fact that we must eat up a particular patch of the city to pay for the building and pay for ourselves and our children to live there, leads to these difficult outcomes. So I guess the self-sufficiency took me on that riff then. That is, it seems strange to, in the context where this format of development is not unusual. Okay, this is not strange to much of the world. So if you read Gavin Shatkin's book, Cities for Profit, you will find examples across Asia where this extraction of value and particular politicization and a transscalar organization of the distribution of the value is what is at stake. In that context, what is the point of thinking about policy interventions which construct a hierarchical scalar version of governance? are there perhaps other sites of intervention where to work with this transcalar formation, to work with the specific actors that are on play, could be important. That is, we could learn something from our general intellectual efforts to understand the reconfigurations of the urban. So I'll leave that there.